Hey everyone, and welcome. And it's great to be here for our first ever Microsoft Learn Live series. So the idea with Learn Live is it's a series of guided courses and sessions to increase your knowledge of Azure and the various technologies in Azure. And through it, hopefully you're going to learn ways to use Azure and apply Azure to your own projects as well. So we're hoping this will be a very practical series. So we're your hosts for what we hope is going to be an incredible series of classes and courses, which are going to cover all manner of Azure services. So my name's Kim Philpotts, and over here, this is my co-host, Glenn Stevens. So Glenn, listen, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself while I bring up a slide with your details?
Hi, Kim. Hey, everyone. My name is Glenn Stevens. I'm a senior content developer at Microsoft on the Learn team. You can find me on Twitter at Glenn T. Stevens. My location on the planet is in Queensland, Australia, the Sunshine State. If you ever this way, you can feel and experience the super warm temperatures. A little bit about my background. I've been a developer for a long time. I started coding in my early teens and built a lot of things. From education, security, finance, all sorts of apps as a developer, team lead, architect, and a range of others. That's probably my nutshell introduction. What about you, Kim? Do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, why not? Well, let me advance this slide here. So my name's Kim Philpotts. I'm also a senior content developer over at Microsoft. Like Glenn, I've been in the industry for many, many years. Over here, we can see some details. If you want to get in contact with me on Twitter or on the emails or what have you. So, I've spent a lot of time doing mobile development, Windows development, and of course now cloud development as well. So that's kind of what we're going to sort of. Well, that's a little bit about myself, and just for reference as well. I'm also on the same part of the planet as you, Glenn. I'm in Australia, but being Australia, I'm a few thousand miles away, down in Melbourne. Alrighty, so let's let's talk a little bit about a bit more about live learning. And so, really, the idea here is whether you're new to Azure or whether you've used a little bit or a lot. What we're going to do is we're going to guide you through some of the concepts required to put an Azure solution together. And I suppose one of the first questions that a lot of people will have is how is this different to a lot of the content that we already have, perhaps on the documentation pages or the Microsoft Learn pages, the blogs. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of presentations and documentations on Azure. So where Learn Live is different is we've really built this from the ground up with education in mind, haven't we?
Oh, we have, and that's probably its core difference, really.
Yeah.
The ability to focus on the learning paths.
Yeah, and so we've got we've got a team of content creators and developers and instructional designers, bringing together all of that knowledge to provide a targeted series of content designed for learning. So really, what it's doing is it's sort of joining the dots together, and focusing on solutions, not just the individual parts of Azure, which can be can be a little bit challenging. There's so many different parts of Azure that if you just take them all in isolation, it can be difficult to understand how to build a complete solution. So that's kind of where we're a little bit different. Now let's just talk a little bit about, not us for a moment, Glenn, but about you, the learner, and some of the, what our expectations are, I suppose. So really what we're doing is we're assuming that most people are probably developers. Perhaps you've worked in the .NET space. I know I've worked in the .NET space for a long time. Maybe you're making a move into the cloud, and you're probably familiar with the Microsoft stack, and it's time to move into the cloud. So I think really where we're aiming this content is sort of the beginner to intermediate users of Azure. And I suppose what we're talking about is very much for this first series as well. We'll have other series that go into a lot more detail as well. And also, we kind of have the expectation, or we're assuming that most people are have a bit more experience in sort of the offline technologies, if you like. So that's a little bit. What else have we got in our learner profile there that we should talk about?
Well, you probably should be reasonably familiar with Git or version control. We're going to use GitHub for our demonstrations as our source control system. Ideally, you would have worked with the Azure portal a little bit. You may not have worked with it much. Maybe you've just gone through to a few meetups or seen some presentations where someone's showing the portal. So you're familiar with how the portal works at the very least. Ideally, you would have signed up to an Azure account already. Mm-hmm. Anything else, Kim?
No, I think that's it. Mostly people getting started. But I mentioned that Live Learn is really about dealing with scenarios as well. And so in this first series, we're going to have a scenario that we're going to work through. So then I've got some slides here to actually walk through the solution. So how about you talk us through this thing called Van Arsdale?
Cool. Excellent. So we've got this fictitious company called Van Arsdale, and really a real estate business. And as part of their business, they're running a nice, lovely website where they're selling real estate property. Mm-hmm. So the project's built with .NET Core. It's using a SQL database. That's a very common combination and something you'll find with many projects out there. So it's a pretty typical setup. I think most line of business developers, when they're writing an app, they'll tend to use that combination of .NET and SQL Server.
It's pretty typical setup, absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost the bread and butter of most projects out there. And the entire solution is deployed and hosted on premises at the moment. So in that configuration, we're responsible for the entire maintenance of the system, not only the software, but also the hardware and updates, patches, and making sure there's enough bandwidth and connectivity. But the website in the on-premises mode is experiencing challenges just because of its popularity, and only get more popular as the main for Arsdale runs through. And it might have additional regions within the same country or maybe internationally or both. So it's got the challenges. Will new hardware be required? Will we need more bandwidth? Maybe we'll need some extra administrators to monitor that solution. So an on-premises solution actually becomes far more complicated as you scale up.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are we going to do with this, Glenn?
That's a good question, Kim. Well, as the leader of the development team, you've been tasked to think about a migration to the cloud instead of upgrading the on-premises installation. And there's things you want to consider, like most architectural decisions, when you're making a decision. So we're going to look at moving to Azure, which is going to be the focus of this first Learn Live session or series of classes. And the first thing we need to do is to look at what Azure services we'll use for the project. We'll also then learn how to make the solution scale. And we'll have a much more...
That's super important, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll have a more scalable architecture, not only for the web application, but also for the database and other services. We'll also take advantage of some of the other benefits of being in the cloud. And we can use services like Azure Storage to store our image files centrally. And we've also got two different types of data that we'll be using. Of course, we'll be using relational data with our SQL Server database, mm-hmm. but also we've got some file storage that we need to take care of where we place our images, which is a common situation as well. People will upload files, need to download content from somewhere too. And how do you do that in a scalable way? We'll talk you through that.
Yeah, and that's pretty important, right? Like, having a look at some of those cloud native solutions like blob storage to help out with your applications.
Yeah, exactly. And we're also going to cover how to make the whole development story easier with automatic builds and deployments. So that's what we're going to cover for this solution. So what are we going to cover next?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's take a little step back here and let's talk about what we're going to cover in this first series, right? So this first series that we have comprises of 5 different sessions. It's called Moving to the Cloud. And we're going to go through that scenario that you just talked about. And very important to know is this is going to be a live learning experience, which of course means it's interactive. So anyone should feel free and please introduce yourself in chat, ask any questions as we go through. Now we also have some code available over on GitHub for our application. Let me just show people where that is. Oh, that's not what we want.
Cool.
Let's come over here. And so we have this URL here. So I'll go ahead and I'll paste that into into the chat window. So in this GitHub repository, you'll find all the code for the existing on-site version of the application, if you like, and then sort of some descriptions here and some deploy to Azure sections here for, for basically being able to deploy this to Azure. But we're going to walk through all that as we go through. We also have the solution deployed into Azure as well. So this is the website that Van Arsdale has. The idea here is it's showing a bunch of different properties, and Renee here, and people can come in, they can click on one of these, and ironically, it's showing this message about speeding things up in the cloud. And here's our property that we have, so we can see the property here. We can show all details.
Well, granted, we're also streaming live as well, so our internet is being chewed up quite a lot.
It is, and we are in Australia, so we do have Australian internet. Absolutely.
Yep.
There's also
an
administration part of this as well. So this is the application that we're going to take, and as we mentioned before, it's in ASP.NET Core. We're going to move that up into the cloud. Alrighty, so let's have a look at these sessions first of all, shall we? So this very first session, we're going to be having a little bit of a look at the different hosting models in Azure. We're going to talk about those different hosting models where they're appropriate. We're then going to sort of focus in on one of those hosting models for our application, for the Van Arsdale application. Once we've gone through this first session today, in our next session, we're going to talk about databases. So some of the different database approaches that are available to us. And we also mentioned Van Arsdale runs an on-premises SQL. So how do we get that up into the cloud? And more importantly, how do we get it up in the cloud without having to rewrite our application as well? So pretty much at the point here in our 5 sessions, we're actually going to be up in the cloud entirely. So from there, we're going to talk about deployment. Why is deployment important, Glenn?
Well, of course, you've had that situation where you're running an application, someone else is running it, and they go, well, it works on my machine. And it's a classic problem that we all have, where someone's configuration is different to yours, whether it's another developer and they're trying to do the same thing. Maybe there's files or packages that are missing, and you want to make sure that the build process is repeatable and has the minimal impact on your team as possible. Ideally, that should be automated. So that ideally would also mean it works on everyone's machine. So we're going to use the deployment center to automate our build and deployment.
Okay.
Of our application to the cloud.
Cool. So once we've done that, we now have a repeatable process for deployment. We can then start taking advantage of some of our cloud features. So we mentioned blob storage for images, right? So basically offloading some of the load from our website onto blob storage so that they can be serviced sort of out of process almost from our web. So for this, we're going to talk about what Azure Storage is, do a bit of an overview of that. We're going to talk about, creating a storage account. And here we'll actually do some code changes, right? We're going to actually modify our application just a little bit in order to be able to take advantage of that. And then we're going to have final session. So our final session, we're going to talk about monitoring our application, because that's important. With any application, you basically put it into production. Most of us are developers, and we know that sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes we want to see how much processing power we have available to us, or are we hitting bottlenecks? So we're going to talk about monitoring using metrics. We also want to talk about alerts as well. So if something goes wrong with that system, how do we get alerted of it? And of course, one of the great things about the cloud is things can be scaled very easily. So that elasticity that we talk about in the cloud. So how do we set up some scaling rules in there as well? All right, so that's our 5 different sessions there.
Cool, that's a lot. That's going to be some good fun there, Kim.
It should be. It should be good.
Cool. Now, I also want to mention that we're live and interactive too. We had a picture of Renee on the real estate site from before. So if you've got some questions coming through, post them on the chat window. We're going to try and get to as many questions as possible. We've got some moderators on the line. Them. So again, feel free to interact by asking questions or just saying hello. I'd like to know who's out there. It's going to make it a more social experience for everyone too. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into some content, eh? So we'll have a look at choosing a hosting option and then deploying our application. So Kim, do you want to take that away?
Take this away. Have a look at what we're going to cover here. Yeah,
please.
Okay, so this first topic is all about investigating choosing our hosting option, as we said. So there's a number of different approaches for hosting your solutions. Different approaches have different pros and cons. Different advantages, disadvantages, depending on your application. One might be more suitable than another. So we're actually going to kind of do this in two parts. So the first thing we're going to talk about is those hosting options. And then we're actually going to go through the process of, deploying some code up to Azure and actually get that on-premises website hosted up in Azure. Okay, so before we actually go into creating things in the portal, let's just take a little bit of a discussion about what's required to actually, get an application up and running. And so there's a number of different things. It's not just our application, is it, Glenn? It's a lot of other stuff in here as well.
No, it's things like the network, the disk that you run on, the servers, the operating systems, even things like power, redundant power, the backups and testing restorations. There's no real correct answer. There's actually a lot of these little pieces, and there's a lot of things required. So the question is, who owns and maintains and manages the various pieces? And this is where the different hosting options really come into play.
Yeah. So yeah, like choosing the right option allows us to focus on just the bits that we need, without getting bogged down in a bunch of management of low-level pieces that we would prefer somebody else to do, really, when it comes to.
And there's a difference between on-premises and the cloud as well. So it looks like you've got the on-premises slide up there. Kim, do you want to take us through the context there?
Yeah, so if we start off with on-premises, right, which is kind of really your traditional, non-cloud approach, if you like. So sometimes people call it on-prem, on-premises. But this is where we, as a company, own those physical servers or virtual machines. So we go and we purchase those. We put them in a data center, and we're not only responsible for the initial purchase of that hardware, but we're also responsible for things like configuring the operating system, updating as patches come through. So there's a lot of things that we need to manage here, and it's not just from a software side, it's also the physical security. So a lot of stuff going on here. Network cables, power supplies, disk drives, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff to manage, and it tends to be very, very costly in terms of upfront capital expenditure. But it also requires a lot of skills as well. So time and money to keep this running. So if we contrast this and we talk about moving to the cloud, let's talk about the sort of one of the other options that we have available to us, which is infrastructure as a service. So what do we mean by that, Glenn?
Well, infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. How do you pronounce it, Kim?
I say IaaS.
IaaS, cool. Yeah, it's one of those situations you can achieve using Azure. So what you can do is you can go out and provision a virtual machine, which would still leave you responsible for building and deploying the application, and then you'd also need to configure the operating system through the way you need it. So if you want to host a web application on that virtual machine, you'll also need to make sure the operating system has all the right required pieces. Like you need to install a web server like Internet Information Services, and then deploy that. Make sure you've got the .NET runtimes or the appropriate .NET runtimes on there. And with IaaS, at least all the hardware is taken care of by Azure. And it's not just the hardware in the sense that Azure Data Center has servers and disk drives and network cables and routers and power supplies. Azure Data Centers have all that, but they also provide infrastructure like physical security and things you'd expect from a data center, like backup generators and cooling systems. So virtual machines in Azure have a lot to offer with with IaaS, and it's certainly one way we could deploy our application and have the utmost control over the environment. But when we're building our applications, we can push even more responsibility to Azure using the platform as a service feature. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Kim?
Yeah, so platform as a service or PaaS, I say PaaS. The idea with PaaS is, and that's what we're going to focus on in this series. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to get all of those pieces managed by the cloud. And so, we as developers, we're familiar with this sort of concept of abstractions to encapsulate, complex operations. With PaaS, what we're doing is we're kind of raising the level of abstraction above IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. So we don't have to even think about that low level infrastructure stuff, or that sort of mid-level stuff like operating systems and where are we running that. Instead, all of that's taken care of by Azure, and we can just focus on building our applications and actually adding business value. And so that actually turns out to be really, really powerful, because not only do we not have to focus on those parts that we perhaps would outsource somewhere else, like Azure. It also means if we need like additional computing power, because we've got more people coming onto our website, we don't actually have to go and buy more servers, or in an IaaS model create additional virtual machines and then configure each of those. With PaaS, we can basically just sort of go to Azure and say, hey, let's go and scale that up or scale that out to handle our additional load. And we're going to talk about scaling later on in the series. The idea, I suppose, in a nutshell, is that with PaaS, we get Azure to do more of the work for us in terms of managing the bits that we have. So that's the idea with PaaS. And one of the questions people have, Glenn, is do we have to just choose one approach? Can we mix and match these?
Well, certainly we can. Like, if you think about it, IaaS and PaaS each contain different levels of managed services. You might use a combination of those types. You might have some applications that fit well as well. You might have some applications that are really quite unique and they need their own custom configuration, or even a system where you might have an application by itself. Sorry, an application on one of those VMs that's connecting to a platform as a service product like a Azure SQL database offering. There's lots of these little configurations you can have. There's even architectures like hybrid where you can mix and match what's in the cloud and what's in your local data center. There's lots of infrastructure pieces that you can use.
Yeah, and we should probably have a really quick discussion about serverless. As well. So there's this thing that people have heard of called serverless. What do we mean by that, Glenn?
Well, it doesn't mean that we don't need any servers. We do need servers, but it's really another level of abstraction again. So instead of your unit of measurement being an infrastructure piece like in IaaS, or as a service like you had in platforms, the infrastructure piece where it's utility model of how much you use is how much you pay for, I guess. That's probably not the right terminology, but essentially it's a consumption model on the service. So you might have an application and it's got some function that's being called, and every time that function is called, you'll be charged for it. But it's a very small price, and you're using even less infrastructure than you would with PaaS or IaaS.
Yeah, and you're using it like, you're paying for it as you use it. There's no sort of additional cost there for keeping a machine running. It's literally as you use it.
And you're probably even connecting to other platforms as a service pieces, or maybe even infrastructure as a service pieces from your functions. It's just part of the overall offering. It's probably another series of courses beyond this one, but it's an interesting one to look at, and we'll certainly cover that later.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's some good references for this as well, Glenn. So there is a site at docs.microsoft.com/Azure Architecture, which is actually the Azure Architecture Center. So this is a really good reference for people getting started. or even, not even just people getting started. So a bunch of different patterns here, or if you like, architectural patterns. So this is a really, really great resource. You can see, different reference architectures inside of there. So I thought I'd just mention that because, it's definitely worth a read. A lot of great reference material in there. Yeah. Alrighty. So we've talked a little bit now about those different models. We talked about IaaS and PaaS and on-premises. Let's bring this back to our real estate application. Okay, so in our real estate application, we've got a pretty simple, web-based application. It doesn't have a lot of requirements or any, specific customization to, operating systems or hardware. It doesn't have any sort of crazy back end going on. It's just using a SQL database. So, probably the approach that makes the most sense for us, particularly in this sort of getting started series, is just platform as a service. It takes away a lot of the headaches for us in regards to managing the infrastructure. It really allows us to, just focus on delivering our application. It's not going to require any changes to our solution. And then, we can basically, deploy that. And then one of the great things is once we've got that up and running, we can go and extend our solution. We can go and take advantage of some of those cloud native offerings that we talked about earlier, like, Azure storage, and then if we wanted to extend that further, we could use things like cognitive services or CDNs. So we have a lot of possibilities there available to us.
Yeah.
So I think platform as a service makes sense. What do you think?
It does, and especially from this migration approach where we've got this ASP.NET website. The best translation for the lowest impact is to move to platform as a service.
Yeah. So I suppose the question becomes then, how do we go about provisioning this this solution? How do we host a web application in Azure? Well, there's this great thing called Azure App Services, which is pretty much where you want to go if you're building an application or an API that runs on a platform in the cloud. And so we have these Azure App Services. So what do we mean by Azure App Services, or what do they provide us, Glenn?
Well, app services support a large number of technologies and application types. For example, some things that might make sense for an app service are just a traditional web application. You want to serve HTML into a browser.
Yep.
Something like a blog or e-commerce website, or maybe a content management system. And of course, you can write these applications in a number of different languages or technology stacks, but Azure has you covered there. You can write the application as an ASP.NET application, or as Node or PHP. There's other frameworks or languages that are used behind the scenes. And App Services also supports Windows as well as Linux environments. Especially the ones that are built into Docker containers. It's really versatile. So if you're building anything for the web, whether it's a web application, maybe you're doing a REST or web service, App Services can be the platform that'll host your application or service. Now, of course, we won't have time to investigate all of the potential options. We'll certainly show you some of the configuration screens as we go through, but we'll use an app service to deploy our real estate ASP.NET Core application. And we're assuming that most developers are coming from that C# ASP.NET SQL 7 backend, and this is going to be a good option.
Yeah.
So think about. Oh, sorry, Kim, you were going to say something?
I was going to say, just looking at this slide that we have here, there's a lot of different things that we can use app services for. Exactly as you said, it's logic apps and API apps, all sorts of stuff. So we're going to focus in on this web app side of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool. So we can think about an app service as a host or an application. So if I want to deploy the real estate app into Azure, I can create an app service resource and deploy my application into that app service.
Yeah. But before we just go and launch in, create ourselves an app service, we probably need to talk about something called an app service plan. There's a few bits that sort of fit together here. So really what an app service plan is all about is it kind of defines your set of compute resources for your web application in this case. So you can kind of think, I suppose, of the compute resources as similar or analogous to a server farm, right? So your traditional, web hosting sort of solution, and an app service plan really describes the performance characteristics of that machine that will host our app service. And of course, there's a number of different plans as well that are available within Azure, from free sort of shared environments right through to high-end dedicated machines. And one of the things that we will discuss later on in the series is scaling. You don't have to start off with the biggest, baddest machine possible. One of the great things about the cloud is that we can scale things out as we need them. But I suppose what's important to understand about app service plans is that it really does represent that machine, if you like, that's provisioned in the cloud and hosts your application. And I suppose, like any machine, if we think about a traditional environment where you've got a server, you can host multiple applications on that machine, or in this case, in our app service plan. And so that's, like kind of like a pro tip, if you like, for keeping your costs low. You can deploy multiple app services.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I found that out, I was like, wow, I can consolidate and make everything nice and runnable.
Yeah. And so that's our little pro tip for you, some cost saving. In fact, I've got a little button that does pro tip. Do you want to see it?
Yeah, absolutely. Pro tip. Oh, that's slick.
That was our pro tip. Alrighty. So let's do an exercise.
Cool.
What we want to do now is we want to go and create ourselves a web app and an app service plan in the portal. Right. So people should feel free to follow along. So all we really need here is we need to log into the portal. If you want to just watch, feel free. And of course, make sure if you've got any questions as you go through, just pop them into the chat window and we'll try and cover those off as we go through. Okay, so how do we create things in the portal? Normally there's a number of different ways we can do this, right? We can drive a lot of things through the command line, through PowerShell. We can actually do this through Visual Studio as well. But really the portal's a pretty good place to start off with, because as we go through the portal, it allows us to sort of visualize what's going on. So let me share my screen here, and I'll put this into full screen mode so we're little boxes down the bottom corner. And I'm logged into the portal here. So really where we start off with is we want to go ahead, we want to create a resource, right? We want to create something in the portal. So we've got this great little button here called Create a Resource. And when I press this, it basically comes up with a big old list of things that I can create. And this is actually just the high level versions. As I click onto each of these, there's a bunch of different options. So it can be a little bit intimidating, I think, starting off there. But if we come down here, for example, under web, this gives us our featured or our most common web things. And we can see that we have an app service plan there, right? So that's where we want to start off. Now, if you want, you can actually just come up here and search, and if you kind of know what you're after and you don't want to navigate this bottom section, I could just type in like app service and we get a plan there.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a great feature as well, because there's so many things to look at. Like if you're using a database like SQL Server, you can just type in SQL and see what comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, go SQL, and we've got a bunch of different SQL things in there as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Okay, so we'll say we want an app service plan. Okay, so, like creating any resource in Azure, it'll come up with a bit of an intro page and say, hey, here, let's go and create this. Gives you a bit of a description of what it is. This is actually kind of useful as well. It does have some good links into the documentation and, to get you started with it. But let's just go ahead and smash that create button. See what we have. Okay, so just like creating any resource in Azure, we'll start off with a blade. I think it's called a blade, which allows us to specify, some parameters for creating this resource. So in our case, we're creating an app service plan. First thing is we want to create this on the right subscription. I've got a lot of subscriptions in here, but you'll want to make sure that you choose a subscription that's appropriate for you. And in my case, I'm going to have Visual Studio Enterprise here. The next things that we have is resource groups. So what are resource groups, Glenn? And why are they important?
Oh, they're amazingly important for the management of your Azure products that you're shipping to the cloud. It allows you to essentially group together all the resources so you can find them, manage them effectively. And later on, when we want to delete resources, we can just delete everything in a resource group. Say, for example, you've got an application, a database, a storage system, cognitive services, a logic app, all really working together for the one solution. They can all be in the one resource group. And when you want to manage them, just go, let me delete them all. You delete the resource group and not have to delete all the individual offerings or individual products you've got. So we can create a new resource group. So another thing that you want to consider when you're working with Azure is appropriate naming. There's some guidelines to naming. What are your opinions on naming?
My opinions on naming is hard.
Yeah.
Naming is always hard. I would highly recommend getting together some standards for your organization. A good place to go in the Azure documentation, there is recommended naming and tagging conventions. So this is a pretty cool doc. It sort of says, how do you name things? And, you end up with a lot of different types of resources as you go through Azure, so we're just talking about resource groups, but, lots of different objects. And so sometimes it can be useful to prefix or suffix things so as you can quickly identify them. So I just bring this up because, this gives you some starting points for doing that. And often as well, you have different environments, right? You might have a dev and a test and a QA environment, or even a production environment. And you want to make sure that you know which one you're actually talking to. So this has some good guidelines. I think it makes a good starting point, basically, for establishing your own ones. Now, for us, Glenn, for a resource group, I could select something from here, but we're actually going to create a new resource group. And again, as Glenn said, this is to bring it all together so as, we can find all of the resources for our Learn Live session here. So I'm going to go ahead and using some of the sort of standards that are in that doc, I'm going to call this Live Learn. I'm going to say dev. So it's just our dev, and it's a resource group. So Line Learn dev RG. What do you think?
I think that's great. Now, and resource groups are throughout all the offerings in Azure as well. You'll always find any product will have a resource group assigned to it.
Yeah. And one of the benefits of being in the cloud is you can just spin these things up and then you can destroy them as well. So if you've got them in resource groups, you can find them all. Yeah. Okay. What do we have next? It's now asking us for an app service plan name. So let's call this Live Learn. Maybe we'll call it Dev App Plan. Something like that.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. What operating system we're going to host this on behind the scenes? We'll stick with Windows. We're a bit more familiar with Windows. And then we've got the region.
So why would I choose Linux over Windows, Kim?
That's a really, really good question. I think, Linux is often a little bit lower requirements in terms of running. But, Windows, in our case, we're deploying something from ASP.NET Core. We're coming from a Windows environment. It kind of makes sense to sort of move it across to a Windows. What about yourself? You got any tips there?
No, I'm just raising the question. It's all good. I think with .NET Core, it's actually pretty comparable.
Yeah, it's a good question though. But keep things simple. We'll go with Windows. Now, what about the region? Next thing we have is a region. So this is where it's going to be physically located, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the selection of region is probably more critical than the than anything else because it's very much location based as well. So you probably want to create this as close to your customers as possible just to avoid network latency. So what are we choosing for this one here today, Kim?
Well, that's an interesting question because we're both in Australia.
Mm.
So we could go sort of Australia East, I suppose, but it's not all about us, Glenn.
Customers for the real estate site might just be in central US or close to
Yeah.
there.
Why
So,
don't, yeah, why don't we stick with Central US, which is probably what it was already. But yeah, that's kind of important, right? To keep it close to your customers. Now, the next thing that we have is we've got the pricing, the all important pricing down here. So why don't we have a look at what we have set down here. So this is how much we're paying for it. And we can see at the moment we've got a standard S1. But we can change the size of this as well. So let's bring this up here. And perhaps you can give us a little bit of a view here of the different sections that we have.
sure. Look, there's broadly speaking three different types of pricing tiers. You've got the shared compute, so that's the free and the shared area. So the two base tiers run an app on the same other service apps, including apps of other customers. So those tiers allocate certain CPU quotas to each app that runs on the shared resources, and those resources can't really scale out there. But free and shared plans are actually best for small scale personal projects that have limited traffic. So that they're great to develop and test on, but once you get to a certain point, you need to move up to something a little bit stronger. So the next tier is the production, or really the dedicated compute. So the basic, standard, premium, and premium V2 tiers run apps on dedicated Azure virtual machines. So only apps in the same app service plan share the same compute resources. And the higher the tier, the more virtual machine instances are available for you to scale out. And the standard service plans is best suited for live production workloads where you're publishing commercial applications to customers. So it'll give you things like custom domains, SSL support, and a range of other high-end mechanisms. Of course, you have SSL support subdomain on the Azure websites domain.
Yeah,
We'll have a look at that
what's
later.
nice actually is as in this here, when you click through different sections here, it'll actually show you the different features that are available. Oh, maybe Glenn has dropped out. And you're back,
We lost
Glenn.
connection there, Kim. I am back. Sorry, Kim, you were saying what's nice about
What's
was the
nice
last
about
third,
this page in the portal, I was saying that as we select different sections in here, it has an estimated cost down here, but it also shows you the different features as well.
yeah. Like I was developing a project a couple of years ago, and I had it just on dev and test. And it was very small, going out to just a handful of people. And as it grew and grew and grew, I just moved up to production, and it was pretty easy to scale up. You've got that scalability option with Azure, which is nice. With on-premises environments where you own the hardware and you need to scale, you have such limited flexibility. The cloud gives you so many good offerings.
Yeah. We got one other here, isolated as well.
Oh yeah. So that tier, it really runs dedicated Azure VMs on dedicated Azure virtual networks, and that provides network isolation on top of the compute isolation to your app. So it provides the maximum opportunity for scale out capabilities.
Yeah.
And you'd really only select an isolated service when you've got a specific requirement for the highest levels of security and performance.
Yeah. Now, if we sort of bring this back to our exercise, we really don't, we're just spinning something up here. We're just, for this initial exercise, we just can start off with, we don't even need an S1 server here. Let's just spin up a free one. So people following along can just spin one up as well. It won't cost you anything at all. So we have this F1 here, and very importantly, we can change this later on as we go.
Yeah.
Okay, or as needs required. So let's apply that. So we'll go free F1. So we can then review and create. Okay. It's going to basically tell us what we have here. So our various IDs here. what our SKU is. So we can go ahead, hit the create button, and up in the portal, it's going to show us that it's submitting that request and it's creating that resource group for us. And then it's going to create that app service plan as well. So this is sort of a slightly newer screen, I suppose, in Azure, showing you the deployment process as it happens.
But the app service plan actually doesn't take too long to create, so I don't think we'll be seeing that little animation go for too much longer.
It shouldn't take too long. But it's a good time for any questions. If anyone's got any questions, might be a good time to cover those off. Let's just give this a moment. It does make me wonder whether we should have one already set up.
Well, it didn't take that long. You can see it's there.
Yeah.
Like certain resources, I think it's important to let people know that certain resources will take lengths of time to set up. An app service plan is actually pretty short, but some of the database offerings take a little bit longer. Like you might wait 5 to 10 minutes for a Cosmos DB to be created, just because there's lots of infrastructure. But once it's created, it's there and ready to run. An app service won't take too long. You'll see that shortly anyway.
Yeah. So so that's created it, and it also gives us a link to the resource it created as well. So we've got our app service plan. We can sort of come here and have a look at the details of that as well. Okay, so we've got a plan set up, but where we want to go now is we actually want to actually add a web app to it, right? Because it's like we've provisioned a machine, we haven't put anything on the machine yet. So let's go ahead and add a web app onto here. So we can come back here, we can say create a resource again.
Yeah.
This time we want to create ourselves a web app, and it's a pretty common thing. So it's sitting here in the popular section. Okay, so we'll go select that. Okay, quick quiz for you, Glenn. We've got a subscription here. What should we use as our resource group?
Well, I think we should use the resource group we've already created, and that's really, I like to think the resource group as the solution name that I'm dealing with, so I can deal with it all in as one coordinated unit.
Yeah.
Yes. And then other nice benefits to that as well. We don't really discuss ARM templates, do we? It's probably too early for that.
Probably a little early to discuss ARM templates,
but there's some management benefits of resource groups, and if you do it well, if you create appropriate units for your solution and put them in a resource, the same resource group, it will serve you well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we'll select that one. We need to give this a name, right? So this is probably the hardest bit, I would argue, coming up with what has to be a globally unique name inside of here. All right, and I'm just going to cancel that phone call that I got because I didn't turn my watch off. All right, so let's call this perhaps Learn Live Dev.
And then probably web app dash app.
Let's go with that. That's available.
Good.
All right. Okay, cool. So we've got a name for it. Next, we can publish it either as code or as a container. We're just going to go with code, I think, at the moment. That's all we need.
Cool.
Runtime stack. Okay, so this is what you're talking about earlier on, Glenn. There's a lot of different options for what we're running. Yeah,
so the .NET options are normally your C#, VB.NET, or even F# if you're so inclined. If you scroll down, there's some Java options too. There should be Node, I think Python and PHP, and Ruby as well. So all the majors really are covered.
Yeah.
So there's some great opportunity for you to just go, I want to deploy this app into Azure and use the tools and languages and frameworks that I'm already comfortable with.
Yeah. Our solution's .NET Core 2.2. So let's select that one. Again, we're on Windows. That's where we're doing this. We want to keep this. We want to keep this in the same region.
Yeah.
okay, as our app service plan. So remember, the plan is like the server. This is like we're installing a web server on it. So we've got to have a learn live dev, select that plan, which is a free
Cool.
F1. Beautiful. So then we can step through monitoring. At the moment, let's turn application insights off. So that's just to give us some additional logging in there. We don't need that at the moment. That would require us to set up an application insights instance. So we'll just ignore that for the moment. And we'll go ahead and we'll create this. Okay,
Cool.
so again, we go to our review and create page. It's going to show us all of our details. Smash on the create button.
And this one's going to take on the app service plan, though, isn't it?
Normally, yeah. So you can see it's deploying to our resource group here. But it should only take a minute or so.
Yeah, it's so much quicker than going to a hardware manufacturing and ordering a server, waiting for it to be delivered, delivering it, buying the upgrades, installing the upgrades, configuring everything, putting your application on it, testing that your application runs, and going through all those pieces, which could be days or weeks or months of work, depending on your configuration. It's so much quicker.
Let's not forget we would have had to get rack space as well.
Rack space, yeah. So much approval. You know, it's interesting. One great thing about the cloud is that there's a lot of organizations that to have really strict policies on ordering new equipment, but they don't have strict policies on using utility services like the cloud. So it actually might be beneficial there too. Wow, that looks like it deployed just then. So much quicker than waiting for delivery of hardware that needs to be manufactured.
All right, cool. So we've got our resource. It says, hey, I've created this. And we can click on that again and we can have a look at what we have. And actually, if we see what we have here, we've actually got ourselves a URL.
Oh,
So
cool.
our Learn Live Dev app as your websites. If I was to go and click on this, it's actually going to go and hit this on the web.
Awesome.
Now, we haven't actually put any code there yet, have we?
Yeah, but it's running, isn't it?
It is.
That's
it is
awesome.
running. So so we've actually spun that up. Beautiful. And of course, what we'd want to do then is we'd want to deploy some code to it, wouldn't we?
We would. And what's the best way to do that?
Look, there's a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about a number as we go through the series. So there's this deployment center, or you might have noticed that actually on this little page that it gives you, it says, hey, go to the deployment center, which is actually what I just did. So there's a lot of different ways. There's, the CI/CD approach from Azure repos or GitHub or local Git. There's manual deployments, through a lot of different options there. Look, what I think would be worth doing is just going through Visual Studio. What do you think?
I think that's a really good approach. That's a lot of where us developers spend all our time. And if we can find an easy path there, that's going to be good for day-to-day management.
All right. And again, this is just one technique that we can use, creating a project in Visual Studio and publishing from Visual Studio. But it's a pretty common one. But you can do it through, as we said, GitHub repos. You can actually just deploy it through command line, things like that. A lot of different options, but let's just go and create a new project in Visual Studio. So
Awesome.
this will just be to give us a bit of a baseline here. Okay. So we're going to create ourselves an ASP.NET Core web application. Okay. So, if we type in ASP.NET Core, we can say, hey, yeah, we want a web application. Next, I'm just going to put this in my temp folder. What are we going to call this, Glenn?
Well, it's really going to be a throwaway. Let's call it Learn Live Upload Example.
It's a really long name.
Yeah, I tend to be fairly verbose. My apologies.
Sure. All right. It doesn't really matter what we call this. It's just creating it locally. And so I'm going to say create.
I'm going to ask you some more questions to this anyway.
It
So what
is.
kind of web application are we trying to make?
Yeah. Let's just go with an MVC.
Cool. And now also we want to check our framework and make sure our framework is compatible with what we've got configured on the server.
Yeah,
We've got
that's a good point.
ASP.NET 2.2 on the server.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got our model view controller selected. That should be fine.
Beautiful. Let's create that. All right, so we've got ourselves a little application here. We could let's just build it locally first. That's always a good test.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Go to build.
I'll run it locally.
Yeah, we'll run it locally. So build succeeded. Actually, that's sort of behind my head, but it says build succeeded. And I'll just run it on iOS Express, so locally. And all things going well, we're going to just get the standard sort of welcome page.
Sorry, I'm leaning in a little bit too much. I'm super excited about seeing this run. Yes, look at that.
I understand. I understand. All right, there we are. So it's running. Okay, that's a good first start. Now, let's say we wanted to publish this up to Azure.
Cool. So we need to stop the application first. It's stopping running. Yeah, the web server stopped. Excellent. Yep. And what we want to do is right-click on the project for now, and there's an option there called Publish.
Are you telling me to right-click Publish, Glenn Stevens?
You know what? I am, and Damien Brady, who is one of our Azure dev advocates, always says, friends don't let friends right-click Publish, which is good and solid advice. But we're showing you the one way to do it, and we'll show you the better way a little bit later. We're showing you kind of the minimum viable path, but not the ongoing management path, which we'll show you as part of the series anyway. But we want to select the Publish option.
Yep.
And this is going to bring up that publish target dialog. Glad you're enjoying this, Kim. Now, in this dialog, we've got a bunch of different options where we'd like to publish. In our case, we want to publish an app service. And we've already created the app service, so we can just select the existing one, which is what we're going to do.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, right? Like everything that we did up until now, where we created the app service plan and the app service in the portal already, we could actually have just done from Visual Studio, right?
Exactly. But it might be that you have a project a little bit later that's someone else has written using Node, and you might need to upload that. What do you do there? So it's good to know about the options you have available too.
Absolutely. But we already have one, so we'll select existing, right? And this button down here says publish. Okay, what we're really doing is setting up we're setting up this sort of publishing. It's not going to publish it straight away. It's going to ask us some more questions, because of course it needs to know where to publish it, which is really what this dialogue's about.
You can see on the top right, that's actually the same Azure account that you're using on the portal, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's important as well, because if you have multiple Azure accounts, you can select the appropriate one. Yeah. And then it's going to show you the subscription. So there'll be a bunch of, potentially a bunch of subscriptions underneath there. Make sure you choose the right one. And then you basically say, hey, what do I want to view here? Resource groups or resource types. As we talked about, it's nice to sort of drive it from a resource group perspective. Nice and understandable. So it's actually showing me the resource group here. Learn Live Dev RG, which we created. And then we have our app service. So we can go ahead and we can select that. And if I hit the okie dokie button, it's actually creating me a profile, publishing profile, building the solution, and then uploading it. So that's what we'd see down in this output down here.
Cool. So that shouldn't take too long. We've got essentially an empty ASP.NET core project that's running. So the build shouldn't take too long. It's then a matter of uploading the initial batch, and subsequent batches would just be the differences, really. Yeah. You can see already we've got that uploaded to the cloud, and that's running in Azure now. If we look at the URL, that's live on the web. Yeah.
There we are. So that's it. It's up in the cloud. Okay. And just to prove it, you could hit that URL right now, and you should actually see it. And if we made some changes to this, right? So this is the cool thing about these publishing profiles. If I came in here and I said, what am I changing? Let's change our index page here to say, instead of homepage, let's say, or actually, let's not change that. Let's change the welcome. Hello, live. Okay, and then I can just go and publish this thing again. Okay, and smash the publish button.
We should see the changes.
Yeah.
Now, Kim, can I ask the question? If we've got our source code to our Van Arsdale app, would we deploy that in a similar way? Like if we had a folder that contained all the files, we could actually just say, select an existing app and deploy into that app service.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want you to acknowledge this awesome update, but yeah, absolutely, right? So why don't we just go ahead and do that?
Cool.
Okay, so just as anyone sort of following along, just as a reminder, sorry, let me just bring up here. So this is the URL. I'll post that into the chat window. So you can just download this, or you can fork this, or just clone it locally. Let me go ahead and open it up. And again, we'll just go the same approach, right? We'll run it locally. In fact, here it is right here. Right. So this is our project. I'll let people spend their own time looking through this. We're not sort of teaching ASP.NET Core here. It's not a particularly complex application at all. It is backed by a database. Right. So I'm just going to run this locally again. And this is also using a local database as well. So you might see that it has different properties in here. So
there's no picture of an A.
There's no picture of an A. In fact, I should probably clean this database out. But look, we can come and have a look at these, and we can show the details. This is all running locally.
Awesome.
Cool. So let's say we wanted to publish this. It's pretty much the same process, right? I could say, let's go and publish. Now,
you know what? I know this is educational, so I'm going to let you, as my friend, right-click publish.
You're a good man.
Right.
Now, previously, I've set this up to publish somewhere else, right? So you notice that it's got some different URLs here. So I'm actually going to create a new publishing profile. So pretty much what we did before, right? So we'll say, hey, an app service, and we can just deploy this to the same place and just blast away that hello world we did earlier.
Awesome.
I don't need advanced there. I'm just going to select an existing. And again, we'll say, hey, let's have a look at those resource groups. And that's that same one that I had earlier on. So hit the okie dokie button.
And that should do the same publishing process that you did before. We'll probably wait a little bit longer because the app's a little bit more involved, but probably not too much longer. And then we'll be able to see it running. This is going to be nice. If we're in the same room, Kim, I would high five you on when this runs.
Well, if we swap back to this scene here, don't leave me hanging. There we go. We can high five. Beautiful. All right. So it's basically packaging up all of this stuff down here, sending it up to the web. Shouldn't take too much longer. There we are. It's succeeded. Of course, it's got the same URL as what we created our file new, because we said, let's put in the same app service plan. App service. Just restarting this, and just a moment. In fact, maybe it has already brought up the page actually.
Well, we should be able to go to the old page and just hit refresh.
Yeah, if we go and hit
but
that.
it might have deployed it, but it might need to configure it locally. Is that running the new version?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Up in
awesome.
Live Dev.
Excellent.
Okay, so
we do.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just reading that yellow line there, the attention using the mock data repository did you configure a database connection string. So we've uploaded the app. We haven't done all the parts yet, but we're certainly getting there.
But we have deployed the source code for the real estate application up into the cloud. So what this is telling us is it's telling us, hey, this has got this server or this application connects to a database. That database isn't up in the cloud yet. So that's kind of our discussion for our next series. So why don't we? So we're pretty much done for the moment. We're running just about on time. Let's do a quick review. Can you take us through that? A little bit of a summary of what we covered off in today's session.
Sure thing. So we've covered a bit of ground, a fair bit of ground actually. We've talked about the various hosting models available to us in Azure. We've defined the terms app service and app service plan. And finally, we've also seen an approach to publish a local application to Azure via Visual Studio. So we've really just come to the end of another session. Our next follow-on session will actually look at the database options. So a big thanks to everyone for attending. I think Kim, thanks for being a gracious co-host today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, it's the other way around, but this is really only the first of our sessions. There's 5 in total. Our next session, we're going to talk about taking our database from our local data center and moving it up to the cloud, and all the configuration tooling and systems in order to do that. So join us here back at Learn Live, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Fantastic. All right. Well, take care, everyone. See you next time.